Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Panasonic ZS100 on the left and the Sony RX100 Mark IV on the right. Now let's start off with pricing. You're looking at a $700 camera from Panasonic, part of their Lumix point-and-shoot brand that just launched on the 25th, at least here in the U.S., of March. The Cybershot to the right, $950 US, and it launched back in August. These cameras both sport 1-inch sensors. These are not APS-C or full-frame cameras. These are point-and-shoot compact cameras that are meant to be great travel companions. In many cases, replace your gear bag, and they do that for many people, depending on their needs. But their pricing, and again, very similar sensor, is inherently going to draw many comparisons for shoppers out there. But the first thing I want to point out about the brand new Panasonic offering is that it does have a 10x zoom lens, which means a wider range of variable aperture compared to the Sony offering, where here we have 25 to 250 millimeters, whereas with the Sony we have 24 to 70 millimeters. And as a result, Sony has honed the speed of the Zeiss glass employed here in the RX100 to a degree that you simply can't when it comes to the general compromise of dealing with a zoom piece of glass. Now we've got Leica on one side, Zeiss on the other. Neither is one to be ashamed of. They're both, the best names basically in the business. But again, that variable aperture range, here we've got as high as 5.9, whereas here 2.8 is where things top out. So a much more prime-ish or prime-esque lens on the 20-inch sensor from Sony, as opposed to the 10x lens that is on top of the 20-megapixel 1-inch sensor with the Lumix. But that to me really is ultimately what is going to decide for most of you which camera is right for you, because since we know the sensors are so similar, and then the lenses are basically complete opposites in terms of identity. One, the Panasonic really trying to achieve all the flexibility you could want from a travel camera, whereas the Sony really trying to do what it can best rather than do everything. I think that's going, at least for many consumers, to be a deciding factor, despite the variable aperture range being broader on the zoom lens. In terms of feature sets, again, it's a give and take with both models. Both have EVFs. The Panasonic EVF is inferior to the pop-out RX100 Mark IV from Sony. Twice the resolution here with the Sony, just better in every way. Even the fact that it pops out of the camera is a better feature, in my opinion. You can see it ejecting right there, because whether you're left or right eye dominant, you're not going to have to press your face into the screen. Whereas the Panasonic, on the other hand, has a built-in EVF on the flush left side of the camera, which means if you're left eye dominant like myself, you're going to be pressing your face against the screen. The irony also is that the Panasonic has the touch screen. The Sony does not. And that is something that Sony simply hasn't taken on and Panasonic has embraced. Another thing I want to point out is that both of these cameras are made in China, which only is strange because typically top-of-the-line cameras from both of these companies historically have been made in Japan. Panasonic has done a lot of great things with this offering, and I'll tell you right now, if you're not interested in watching the entire video, that if flexibility and overall feature set is really what you're after, it seems like the Panasonic is the better choice, especially because it's less money. The Sony, on the other hand, if you don't care about the limitation of the lens range as well as its inability to record more than 5 minutes of 4K or UHD video, is the better choice when it comes to what it can do. Even though the Sony doesn't have a touch screen, it does have a fully articulating screen, which means when you actually want to compose a selfie or you're vlogging in 1080p, not necessarily the overheating 4K mode that I wish could be addressed in a firmware update, but thus far has not. You do have that flexibility, whereas with the Panasonic, again, less expensive, and in my opinion, more features in many senses, you've got a fixed screen. I think Panasonic figured that because you had the EVF, that didn't matter, but this is one area where Sony, I think, was more attuned to what consumers were after, even though Again, no touchscreen. Both have a center-mounted flash. Both have, again, UHD video capture, but the Panasonic doesn't have the overheating issues that the Sony does, besides the fact that as a video camera, the Panasonic has a 25 to 250 lens, which definitely makes it more of a video camera than the Sony. Also, the Panasonic has 5-axis image stabilization, something the Sony does not. And I have found that in my use, the Panasonic stabilization is superior to the entire build here offered by the Mark IV. And I love the Mark IV. Don't get me wrong, I've been using it since launch, and up until this point, I could easily say it was the best compact point-and-shoot camera on the market. But if you cared about the fact that it had limitations regarding the reach of its lens, which was reduced over the course of the generations of the RX100's maturation, the Panasonic is kind of exactly what you've been looking for if you didn't want to carry around a bridge camera. And that's what I think makes the XS100 special, besides the fact that, again, I'll keep repeating, it is less expensive. But you do feel that less expensive build quality. I mean, the Zeiss Sony body here is a tank. Even the actual ring for controlling the lens or focus, depending on what you designate it, is all metal on the Sony product. Whereas here on the Panasonic, initially I thought the body was metal. It's clearly predominantly plastic. So just in build quality, you can feel the difference, even though these two are so close in pricing. And that is important to point out beyond the fact that, the Sony has the better EVF or better performance in its more limited focal range, except for on the video side, of course, where it's really more of, we're getting UHD video because we can, not because we should, whereas I do feel the Panasonic product really is built for video in many ways, even though it is cropped, for those of you that are wondering. Two other features that are unique to each camera that I think are important to know. Sony has high-speed or slow-motion video capability on the RX100 Mark IV. That isn't something you'll get in the Panasonic, and this is kind of ironic. I'm not trying to rhyme, but these are all things that could be done in post, but that each company respectively has chosen to do a little bit differently. So with the Sony, you have up to 960 frames per second, at least here in the US, at 1080p, even though it's not legitimately 1080p, that you can capture in small clips. The Panasonic doesn't do that, but instead plays towards the fact that you can use its 4K mode for 8 megapixel captures at 30 frames per second, so that you never miss a moment when it comes to what you're trying to capture in the still world. Granted, 8 megapixels, not the 20 that both of these sport with their 1-inch sensors, but in that crop, the idea is still important that you're not going to miss a moment. The other thing Panasonic offers, and again, these are things that can be done in post, is the ability to do something called post-focus, which is something that's in the GX8, one other Panasonic offering that's much more expensive than the XS100. Well, not much more, but more expensive, and an interchangeable lens camera rather than a point-and-shoot like this. And that is that you can literally take a picture and then on the touchscreen change your point of focus, whether it's in the foreground, background. It's an amazing feature. It's something that does not exist in the Sony world. So both companies have taken things of the post-production world and built them in as respective gimmicks, no question about it. Which one is more compelling to you is going to really come down to the customer that's after either of these products. The other thing I want to point out is that, it's when it comes to picking one of these, you're not going to go wrong. It ultimately, for me, personally at least, really does boil down to whether or not you need the extra lens, the reach that the Panasonic has to offer. The menus in the Panasonic are cleaner than the Sony, and yes, this is coming from someone who loves Sony digital imaging products, but can acknowledge where they go wrong. Just as, if Sony granted a touchscreen to all of you that complain constantly that they don't have them on any of their cameras, when they did once upon a time, back in the day, early 2000s, that was a very common thing, I think they would be handsomely rewarded by the public that does have interest in their cameras. Being able to select a point of focus, whatever it is, not even post-focus, just pre, would be important. But Panasonic has done a lot of things right here, but most importantly, they've come in at a lower price point. And that's because even though the RX100 is an amazing camera, I used it scuba diving back in January, fantastic, loved the results. Of course, it's not going to compare to its, interchangeable lens brethren from Sony, whether they're APS-C like the brand new A6300, or the A7R Mark II that I lean on for anything where I want zero compromise, the reality is that it does pack the best quality in the smallest form factor available, as does now the brand new Lumix that is to the left of it, because really there is nothing else to compare to it. And that's what makes it unique. Even though I am comparing these two cameras, the reality is that because the Sony doesn't have a 10x lens, variable aperture or not, forget the other features I mentioned, which can all be done in post for either camera, the reality is that there's nothing else like the XS100 on the market, much like there was never really a competing product for the RX100 line, which is why Sony has never really discontinued any of the previous generations, because as long as they can sell, there will be one for every customer, since there literally are 4 generations now. But for me personally, it ultimately, as I've said before, comes down to whether or not you really care about the extra length of, the range that the Panasonic offering has. And the stabilization doesn't hurt. The extra features do not hurt. I wish they would have put an articulating screen on this, especially since the viewfinder really doesn't come out that much. I'm not going to say they could have gone with Sony's design, because I'm assuming it's patented and they would have had to pay Sony. There's no question, on the other hand, that Sony does a better job, in my opinion, on sharpness and overall performance when it comes to the quality of the lens to sensor pairing, but again, at the cost of flexibility. And for many of you, the slow motion, high-speed video capability is irrelevant. In fact, the articulating screen is probably more relevant, and the fact that the Sony has that, I think, makes it more compelling for a lot of consumers. The cleaner menus on the Panasonic, welcomed by me more than you know. But in terms of everything else, they handle very similarly. Ergonomics is not great on either. That's why the RX100 here, you can see I've got the grip. I don't have an accessory like that for the Lumix, but handling on here is not great either. So if you weren't a fan of the handling on the RX100 line, you're not going to feel that much better with the Panasonic, because it's very, very similar. I mean, the RX100 affords no lip to grip. Again, not rhyming intentionally. The Lumix does have this little groove here, but that's not a handle. And when it comes to mode dial and programmable buttons, we're looking at basically the same thing. And you do have a dedicated button to direct the Panasonic as to whether you want to use the EVF or not, which is good. The Sony, on the other hand, like every Sony camera that has an EVF, is intelligent enough to try to make that decision for you based on whether or not you're literally using it. So both are great at what they do, at least so far with my experience, clearly more experience with the Sony. The fact that when I'm holding the actual ring here and using it to zoom or focus, since, again, you can designate for either, you can assign it whatever you like. The fact that I feel like if I grip this too hard because it's made of plastic, it flexes, is something that might turn off some consumers, whereas on the RX100 Mark IV, that just isn't going to happen. This thing is built like a tank. So build quality definitely goes to Sony. Again, performance in the 24 to 70 range that it has to offer also goes to Sony. But the fact that the Sony can't do what the XS100 can, and for less money, is something that inherently is going to attract many, many consumers. By the way, both cameras can shoot in a silent mode, and the Sony can do 16 frames per second, so don't think that it's slow just because Panasonic is advertising 30 frames per second in 4K mode. In terms of autofocus, they are very, very close. There's no question the RX100 Mark IV is the most improved of Sony's breed of cybershot cameras within a compact form factor ever made, and the same applies to Panasonic here with the XS100. But I have to say, the post-focus, when it comes to things you'd have to do in post-processing, if you even could, is a game-changing feature. It is. Whereas the high-speed or slow-motion photography incorporated into the RX100, to me, is far more of a gimmick, because I really don't see a practical use to that. That's something I always could have done in video editing software. So different approaches from each company represents the different identity that they both have to offer, despite the fact that they both are leaning on 1-inch sensors, fixed lenses, different quality EVFs, different feature sets. After all, Panasonic and Sony do need to have different identities, even if they're going after the same consumer. So here, Sony thinks that the consumer that wants to spend $950 on the RX100 is going to be concerned with S-Log and, video grading, whereas Panasonic is basically saying that's not what people are after. They're after a lower price and more overall performance, rather than having video grading features that you could really leave to the higher end line of video cameras or digital SLRs or mirrorless cameras that are aimed specifically at video performance and not what, the general consumer that's after a traditional camera like we're looking at here, a compact point and shoot, has to offer. When I power these on, you'll see right now, very close on the power on time. And I don't have a memory card in here, but, the LCD on the Sony is better. I already mentioned the EVF is better. The fact that the screen moves is better, but then you lose the touch screen. The EVF is better, but here the EVF, besides being inferior, again, left mounted. And yes, Sony does that with the A6300. They do that with many of their mirrorless interchangeable lens APS-C cameras, which I'm not a fan of, but it's a completely different product line, which in all likelihood I will be comparing to the XS100 for those of you that are wondering. But there's a lot to like here. Whichever one you pick, you will not be disappointed. Again, I've said it 3 times through the video. To me, the deciding factor really comes down to whether or not the reach of the Leica-based variable aperture glass on the XS100 is more to your personal liking, besides the fact that this does have the fully articulating screen, which I think for many of you is one of the most important things with how, I don't want to say important, but how commonplace taking selfies has become. After all, even I, not a fan of selfies, but don't enjoy giving my camera gear to other people, especially strangers, to shoot a picture of me. And that's something where the RX100 is usable, and the Lumix, on the other hand, not as much. When it comes to autofocus, they're very close. Video performance, the range and lack of overheating with the XS is a big advantage. So it really is a matter of what your primary priorities are when it comes to selecting your pocketable travel camera that's going to do everything you need. And I think that ultimately, even for me, as much as I love my RX100, have an underwater enclosure for it, the Lumix offering represents a more flexible and versatile tool. Even though it's not as well made, it is significantly less expensive. So hopefully I've covered just about everything you could possibly have to question regarding these two cameras. Again, both are great, but which one is right for you will end up coming down to cost and, of course, what you plan on doing with it. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please subscribe. Later.